to James's presentation. Elizabeth, the meeting is yours.
Okay, before we start here, Jim, I'm not seeing my usual little thing that allows me to watch the chats and know that I can read them all after.
Just click on the chat. You should be able to see it.
I just click on the chats after.
Yeah, now we're after.
Now we're after. Oh, I see. They're, yeah, okay, they're coming up there. Okay, great. Excellent. Okay, so tonight it's my pleasure to present James Casey. I think a lot of you probably know James or have at least met him at some point. Back in 2019, before coronavirus hit, James organized a Welcome Back Birds event in October at the Harris Barn, where we had Delta Nats had a display, and there were all kinds of other displays there. And just everybody wanted to welcome the birds back, the migrating birds. And that was an excellent event. Of course, in 2020, that wasn't possible. And in 2021, wasn't possible again. So what James did was organize a stewardship roundtable with a few very interested parties in bird life in the Delta. And, you know, they all, of course, masked and socially distanced. And I didn't go to the event, Sid did, but I did watch the presentations and the discussion that had gone on at that thing. It sounded like a very interesting event. So James is the Fraser River Estuary Specialist for Birds Canada. And after earning a master's degree in international environmental policy at the University of Northern BC, he had the opportunity to work with the World Wildlife Fund Canada on topics ranging from eelgrass and marine planning to hydropower and the Water Sustainability Act. This experience established a base of knowledge he is now applying into the context of the Fraser Estuary Key Biodiversity Area. On behalf of Birds Canada, he's building support for the development of a Fraser River Estuary Management Plan for the Key Biodiversity Area. And if you're not clear on that concept of a Key Biodiversity Area, there's lots of information online, but basically what it's doing is taking what used to be an important bird area only and changing it to a biodiversity, key biodiversity area, which means that the criteria are looking at everything, plants, animals, marine animals, as well as birds. So it's total diversity of the area. So, and it's very, very strict criteria to become a key biodiversity area. And I have to say that the idea of a Fraser River Estuary Management Plan is certainly not new, but it is certainly needed. And it's something that I really hope James will have good luck with. In tonight's presentation, he's looking forward to the day when, coming probably soon, when different levels of government start looking at things like raising dikes and taking whatever measures they think are required to protect people and property from sea level rise due to climate change. And his concern, and that of Birds Canada, is that shorebirds need to be taken into consideration when they're doing this, because we could potentially destroy their foraging habitat. So I'll let James talk now. That's what you're here for. Thanks, James.
There we go. I got it. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and a pleasure to be with everyone again virtually. Yeah, it's been a bit of a long haul for us since we've been able to gather in person, and hopefully not too much longer on that front. I just wanted to let Elizabeth and the crew know you were talking about the Fraser Estuary Management Plan. Metro Vancouver has passed a resolution to create a task force around establishing a Fraser Estuary Management Plan, again, reestablishing it. There was a meeting of government parties this week or last week on that process. It would be worth connecting with, if you have contacts in Metro, about that, because we're a little bit concerned about the lack of public participation in that process. So if you want to reach out to somebody like Michael Wiebe, who is Vancouver councillor quite engaged, or if you know others, that would be a timely thing to do. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about climate adaptation and shorebirds. I will warn you that I probably have more questions than answers on this front. It's a complex issue, and I have to apologize for the large number of graphs that I will have in this presentation. It's because we're still processing data. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of climate modeling and downscaling and all of that kind of fun stuff that people are struggling with. But there are some conversations and actions happening in Delta, so we will get to that. But it's not going to be that many pretty pictures. I thought I'd start with one to get me out of the bad book. This is Roberts Banks, Brunswick Point in the summer. So we were out there with some people looking at this. So in the bottom left corner, there is a little method that's used to scrape some of the biofilm that you probably will have all heard so much about. You can sort of make out the port in the back. I really like this picture when we think about adaptation, is because we've learned that biofilm is playing a very important role in stabilizing sediment on the Delta. And so when you go out in the summer on the mud flats, it looks a lot different than when the shorebirds are there. You have these green hammocks that are growing where the biofilm is stabilized to the sediment and allowed that marine algae to grow. It's quite a bit firmer than in the wintertime. And if you go out in the winter, you'll see it basically flat. And we'll have a couple of pictures when we come back to that. But when we think about in terms of how do we adapt to climate change, how do we manage sediment levels on the Delta to allow our inward migration or upward migration of these intertidal habitats, biofilm is starting to play a big role in that discussion. So we'll come back to that concept, but I thought I'd open up with that and move along. Second point that's, I think, really important is that we are in a current climate crisis. I think a number of us have been struggling with the climate issue for a decade or two now, if not longer. And when I started working on this, it's about 15 years ago, I guess I did my first climate presentation. And we were talking about what projected, what's to come. And we were thinking like in 2050, there's going to be these impacts. In 2080, it's going to be that much worse. Today, we are living in the midst of a climate crisis. It's only, the surface temperature has only gone up 0.8 degrees around the world, only projected to probably reach in the 2.5 range. But already we're seeing climate related crises playing out in Canada. Our average cost of weather-related disasters is up to $112 million a year. The most recent flood that we went through in BC this year estimated at insured losses of around 450 million. And unfortunately, we've had a tragic loss of life of 595 people attributed to the heat wave in the summer. There was no way when I was talking 10 years ago that I would have said, you know, we're going to burn a whole community. We're going to see 500 people die, and we're going to lose $450 million worth of insured losses. Like that was, and like I would be presenting to town councils on this issue, and that's not the kind of language we'd be using. Nowadays, that's happened, and we have to remind ourselves that we are in a current crisis. That crisis is matched with a collapse in biodiversity. So we have these twin issues that we're struggling with. Which really makes the answer to how do shorebirds adapt a really complicated one. On the climate side, a lot of our projections historically were built around this idea that we were going to reach 1.5 degrees in terms of projected increases. So we were thinking, yeah, you know what, we'll probably act soon enough to mitigate the worst of the changes. As we progress here, it's looking worse and worse. And if we think just about what sort of climate targets have been agreed to at Paris and others, we're looking at a 2.4 degree increase in temperature. That's concerning in that, I mean, it's bad for the environment for sure. But it's very concerning for our human civilization because we start to look at destabilizing human systems, so trade systems, social and cultural systems that support what has been assumed stability in our ability to respond. And we're starting to run up against the crunch in terms of how much can we afford to adapt and how much can we afford to mitigate in terms of larger macroeconomic questions. So that's definitely concerning. And I think really when we're talking to our decision makers, we're starting to talk about how are you adapting to 2.4 degrees of change? Because that's what really on the books in terms of the level of commitment we're seeing from you right now. Going back to sort of thinking about climate, this is from an older report. Older, it's only a couple of years old, but it's from the climate projections report for Metro Vancouver. And it's kind of the thinking that we were thinking about what was going to happen on average in Vancouver. And it was like, well, there may be by 2080, there may be a 6-degree average increase in nightly temperature. And we've learned that that's not really the struggle that we face. It's what happens at the extremes and the level of variability that's happening. And so when you talk about heat stress and related mortalities, it's not because of your average temperature, it's because of that extreme variability that's taking place. Similarly, when we think about precipitation, we were thinking in terms of averages, what the type of average change we're going to see. And on average, we were expecting it would be slightly drier in the summer and slightly wetter in the winter. And we've learned that really it's these variabilities, this new term that everybody now knows, atmospheric rivers, I heard it come up earlier today, what we weren't really thinking about those extreme events, or we were, but we didn't know how to articulate them in a way that would inform planning. So even if we talk to like the range of variability, we're talking like the 95 percentile or something like that, that falls way below the overall precipitation we had this fall, this extreme event that we had to prepare for. And so we've started thinking in terms of 1 in 100 or 1 in 500 return events, and how likely are those to return if we go from like 1 in 500 year event, we go down to like a 1, or that becomes a 1 in 200 year event. So thinking about those kinds of flood events differently. And sorry, when I'm using that flood term, it's basically how often do we see some of these really large flooding events. And this is informing things like the Fraser River, the lower Fraser flood management adaptation strategy that was being developed for the last 4 or 5 years before this recent flooding, and has been really fast-tracked now, of course, as we think about how to build back, or if we even do build back. And it's having some serious impacts on that question around can you get insurance, can you get a mortgage? Do we really want people building back in the floodplain? And some discussions around how do we leave room for the river? How do we leave room for nature to allow to carry out natural processes? So flooding is actually a beneficial activity for the rivers, and it's a high risk activity building in the floodplain. So maybe it's better to leave some room in that river for that process to continue. It's a difficult conversation because people do have established property rights right up to the riparian edge. So there's going to be some difficult losses for people. Similarly, on the seaward edge, we're having similar conversations around whether there should be managed retreat given projected sea level rises and what we've been instructed to prepare for. So the communities have been instructed to prepare for 2 meters of sea level rise. We're expected in terms of the modeling to reach 1 meter. This is something I follow quite closely in terms of what's happening on the Greenland ice sheets and whether that 1 meter is still appropriate. To date, it seems to be, though there's definitely a live debate as people are wondering what that rate of melt on those big ice sheets are going to be. So the 2 meters seems like a reasonable buffer for folks as we look forward. But it does have some big impacts on the municipalities in terms of how much they are going to have to invest in raising dikes, or like I said, managed retreat is another option on the table. within the delta, we'll get to it, but also building codes that sort of raise the flood zone, enable safe flooding when it does happen. And then a really big unknown, and it's really relevant to shorebirds and other seabirds, is this issue of ocean acidification. So it's not a climate change issue in terms of our weather patterns, but it is linked to our carbon emissions. So as our oceans absorb more carbon, they are changing the pH levels within the ocean. And that's having knock-on effects within the invertebrate communities that birds, marine birds, and other species are eating. And one of the known impact that people are watching is the calciation of the shells, and those are being impacted. Another one that I just read about here the other day was the transition from a larval stage of a marine invertebrate into a benthic stage. So basically from the free floating worm in the water to the bug that's attached to the bottom. Is being impacted by acidification as well. So it's impacting that invertebrate community and the way it functions within the natural environment. And the reason I bring it up, I guess, is because that invertebrate community first establishes the benthic connection through biofilm. So that interaction with biofilm and bonding to the biofilm that it's having an impact on. So an interesting co-issue there. But in terms of thinking about how do we adapt and how do shorebirds adapt, a lot of those big trends we have to translate into weather. And this is one of the big challenges in terms of what we call downscaling climate, which are the averages, into the weather, which is what we experience day to day in a given site. And that weather is really what drives the impacts on birds, and what we kind of experience in the time frames of our daily lives. So things such as drought and fire events are things that happen within the time frame of one or droughts multiple years that can impact a life cycle of a bird and productivity. Same with heavy rain events. Something called false springs is when we have that early warm temperature that kind of tricks the plants into blooming, and then you get that freeze, they die off, and negative impact for those relying on the plants. And yeah, definitely rain events, heavy rain events are impacting our foraging behavior. In the Arctic, we're having mismatch in timing between nesting timing and insect availability, phenology. And then right in the middle here is one that's really relevant to the Delta, is that sea level rise question, and that has a huge impact on shorebirds, but we'll get into that in just a sec here. When we talk about impacts of climate and the risks faced by an individual, we have to think, we tend to think in terms of this structure of what is the level of exposure of an individual species, what is the sensitivity to that exposure, and what the adaptive capacity. And thinking through those three elements that help give us some structure to when we say, oh, Dunlin may or may not be more at risk than Western Sandpiper, or black-bellied plovers may be more. And it's really, are they having a higher level of exposure? So climate change isn't occurring evenly across the globe. I think we all have heard how the warming is like 3 or 4 times more in the Arctic. So whereas we've had an average increase of about 0.8 degrees here around the globe, in the Arctic we're sitting at about 3.1. So there's that higher level of exposure to a high impact site. Some species are sensitive to the types of changes that are happening. So shorebird, definitely something like a Western Sandpiper that's heavily reliant on that intertidal mudflat where we're seeing several sea level rise play out. It has a high level of sensitivity. Birds in general tend to have a high level of adaptive capacity. So one of the things we are seeing with birds is we're seeing a shift northward in their communities. So we just had a recent paper come out 2 weeks ago looking at community composition of birds within national parks. And it's anticipated we have something between a 20 and 30% turnover of the species that are in the park. So we're going to see birds that are currently there moving further north, and birds that aren't there currently moving up in to colonize those parks. And so we're going to see that kind of range shift across North America. And it's going to happen in the Delta. I mean, I think we all know about the story of the Anna's hummingbird. It's probably one of our early year-round resident colonial species. What else is going to come? I couldn't say for sure, but it's worth thinking about as we talk about conserving land and habitats versus conserving species. And so that's going to be one of the really hard discussions that we as a conservation community are going to be faced, is this habitat versus species approach. In general, shorebirds are declining across Canada with a 40% rate of decline. That decline isn't spread evenly across all types of shorebirds. And so long distance migrants seem to be more at risk of this decline. And we think it's because they have more sensitive habitats being impacted by a range of activities. Definitely climate is playing into that question, but then we're also seeing a lot of intertidals of coastal habitat being converted to other uses, industrial uses, recreational uses, beach goers, urban disturbance. So definitely the long distance migrants seem to have that higher sensitivity to change, and we're seeing a higher degree of decline. So the two that we're going to focus on here tonight are Dunlin and Western Sandpipers. They have different life history strategies, and so they have different kind of exposures and sensitivities. The Western Sandpiper is a long distance migrant. Well, they would both be classed as long distance migrants. The Western Sandpiper has a more condensed migratory route than the Dunlin, and so and it also has a more condensed breeding habitat in the Arctic. Dunlin, there are a number of subpopulations, and they have a far wider range of distribution across North America. They have a narrower band of overwintering, so they tend to overwinter mostly along the coastline, and then they have a fairly wide breadth of migratory routes they can take between the overwintering habitats and the breeding grounds. So they have these different life history stages that expose them to different risk. Now, in terms of trends, Western Sandpipers seem to be declining. There isn't agreement yet that we're seeing a decline. We have seen roughly a 53%, 54% decline in observations on the Fraser Delta since the early 90s. And that has been matched with declines at other major estuarine sites along the flyway, especially on the northward migration. So there's some indication that it might be an adult survival issue. But then on the other hand, we are seeing, like at Sydney Island just off the coast of Victoria, there's been long-term monitoring there, and we haven't seen a significant decline in the populations at that site. So there's still some uncertainty, but it seems to be like there's a decline occurring of roughly 2% a year of Western Sandpipers. There's a lot of noise in the data. So there's a lot of variability from year to year in the data, and so figuring out whether that decline is actually happening is a challenge that we're trying to address through something called the Migratory Shorebird Project. Some of you may participate in the BC Coastal Waterbird Survey project, where we've been monitoring with the support of volunteers all along the BC coast. For the shorebird, that gets contributed to a flyway-wide monitoring effort, where we're trying to tease out, we count as much of the population as we can with with volunteer support and try and tease out whether there are local site level declines or actual population declines. And so there's ongoing efforts on that front, but there still need to be a couple more years of data before we can reach a conclusion. Dunlin, on the other hand, seem to be stable. They seem to be less impacted on the Pacific coast, but don't hold me to that. We think that's what's happening, but we're not entirely sure. So for now, for the purposes of this conversation, we could say Dunlin are holding stable and Westerns seem to be declining. And the question could be, one of the questions is, why would that be? Why would one shorebird species on the coast be doing better than the other? And it becomes a challenge to tease that out, because there's a number of things that drive shorebird populations. Some of them are environmental in terms of big picture environmental conditions, things like the Pacific decadal oscillation or the North American, I can never say this one, the Pacific North American teleconnection. But it's a kind of the same thing as El Nino, but happening across the northern part of the hemisphere. So there's big environmental conditions that can impact shorebirds. Then there's within the demographics of the shorebirds themselves, there's a certain amount of dependency. They can't have too big of a population or they start competing for food with one another. So there's these inter-shorebird demographic issues. There's predation issues that have arisen in terms of understanding whether peregrine falcons are changing behavior, driving them from sites, making them more difficult to count or reducing their nesting success. And then there's local site issues. So there's development, things like the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 are happening all along the coast, dikes, farmland, urban expansion, all of that is playing into this question. So it takes quite a lot to understand what would be driving these changes in populations. But one of the important ones that we're just starting to learn about, thanks to work on this coast, is that reliant on Western sandpipers for polyunsaturated fatty acids. So this essential minerals within the biofilm that help power their long distance migration. And this is something we didn't really understand until the work of folks like Dr. Bob Elner on the Fraser Delta, as they started to understand there was this foraging behavior on biofilm. So it's slowly pieces are falling into place. But before we talk about the Delta, we do need to talk about what's happening in the Arctic. There are a number of Arctic breeding shorebirds, and a lot of the decline is expected to be linked to what's happening in a mismatch in timing between nesting activity and insect productivity. And so if the shorebirds end up either getting too late or too early on, it's kind of a sensitive thing. They need to have those chicks hatch when there's a peak of available food. Otherwise, if the timing is off, you have a lower survival rate amongst the juveniles coming south. And that really seems to be linked to having an earlier nesting establishment date in the breeding ground. So if they get there and they're able to start developing a nest right away, they can hatch earlier and they seem to have better alignment with the insect productivity and therefore better survival rates overall. That's shifting. The other issue, like we had this year a bit, was variability again. And we had a late season snowfall that seemed to have impacted survival rates. So we'll watch that going forward this year and see what happens. But really, there's an international effort to monitor breeding site survival and successes, and some of the drivers of what's playing out up there. Also concerns around predation and sea level rise also in the Arctic impacting nesting habitats. So that's a big driver of what's happening, and they're just starting to get a handle on that. So that would be a breeding ground impact. when we think about the Fraser Delta as a site of hemispheric importance, we know there's a huge concentration of shorebirds on the Delta. I mean, for Dunlin, that seemed to range somewhere between 10 and 70,000 birds. We had a flock of 70,000 out there last year. I think we're at 53,000 or something like that this winter. For Westerns, that seemed to range from 300,000 to 1.3 million, depending on the year. So these are high concentrations of shorebirds. But the two species are using them differently. So for Dunlin, the Dunlins are using them over the winter. So they're here all year round. For the Western Sandpipers, they're using it as a migratory stopover site. So they're using it for like 3 to 5 days to refuel and then move on. Westerns are kind of here for a range of 3 weeks, but it's likely different individuals through that time as they stop over, feed, and move on. And they're using two types of habitat. They're using this intertidal mudflat habitat, like what we see at Brunswick Point when you're on the wet side of the dike. And then they're also for Dunlin and other shorebirds such as black-bellied plovers or killdeer. Well, killdeer is a different story. Sorry, I shouldn't confuse things too much. For other shorebirds, they're also using the agricultural lands. And so it's maintaining both the ag lands and the mudflats as foraging habitat for these birds. That's important for us when we think about adaptation on the Delta. And so on the ag lands, they are mostly foraging for invertebrates. And we have some historical studies looking at foraging behaviors of Dunlin and looking at their stomachs, and it seems like they're eating the larval stage of something known as the European crane fly, which is an introduced European species, maybe known also as sort of the larval stage is known as leather jackets. So they're eating large numbers of those. On the marine side, the Westerns are feeding predominantly on biofilm. Dunlin are there as well. And Dunlin are feeding on a mix of biofilm and invertebrates. Westerns are also eating benthic invertebrates within the mud as well, so just to a lesser extent. One of the things you'll see in terms of if you're out on the mud flats, the Westerns are using a finer sediment than the Dunlin. So the Dunlin tend to be out in a little bit coarser sediment, doing a little bit more probing, but also slurping some of that biofilm, whereas the Westerns seem to be a little bit closer. So, but the key point is you need both ag lands and intertidal mudflats if we're thinking about adaptation for shorebirds. This is a great photo of great little video of Dunlin, or sorry, these are Westerns and a couple of Dunlin. I can see a couple of Dunlin there. Also foraging on the mudflats. It was taken by Jason Puttyfoot, and it's been slowed right down. So this isn't sort of natural speed. This is like 15% speed. Also, I should say that Jason took this lovely photo behind me of the Westerns as well. And so just in case not all of you are familiar with it, when we talk about biofilm, we're talking about a thin layer of mud or slime on the mud. Like you basically can't see it if you're out there, but it exists. It's just a really slim buildup of slime composed of diatoms that the Western Sandpipers have, and a number of other shorebirds have developed this special tongue that basically acts like Velcro to lift that slime off of the mud. And within that biofilm is a set of essential fatty acids, polyunsaturated fatty acids that help these migrants be more efficient when they're flying. So it's been found in recent research in wind tunnels that their overall power has increased by about 15% due to these fatty acids changing the metabolism of their muscle. And so that's really essential for sort of how fit they are when they arrive on the breeding grounds. But one of the interesting pieces of this story is that the level of polyunsaturated fatty acids seem to get triggered by stress events. So this is something that Dr. Bob Elner and company at Environment and Climate Change Canada have been exploring is why are there higher levels of these fatty acids during certain times of the year? And it seems to be linked to the amount of fresh water, or more precisely, I guess, the frequency of disturbance between fresh and salt water. So it's that saltwater, freshwater pattern that triggers this productivity. And so the Western Sandpipers have learned to arrive on the Fraser Estuary just as the level of available high value fatty acids are being produced. And that's linked to the freshet of the Fraser Estuary. So arriving just after peak freshet season is a key element of this story. And of course, that brings in a climate element in terms of what is the change of runoff that we expect in the Fraser Estuary. So this is a picture taken from a satellite while the flooding event was happening on the Fraser this year. And you can see it's got a massive plume that discharges and mixes right off of Roberts Bank, right off of Delta there. And so thinking about the linkage between climate and the variability in flow and the availability of biofilm, fatty acid rich biofilm, links this issue of precipitation, water management, and managing shorebirds, and also thinking about the impacts of the dike and other water restraining infrastructure, the jetties, the leeways, that kind of thing. So it really ties back to the question of how we manage water on the Delta will be a key question when we think about adaptation for shorebirds. The second piece of managing water on the Delta, if you think about the fresh water, you also got to think about the salt water. And so definitely the challenge of sea level rise and the need to upgrade infrastructure to protect our communities is a real one. It's a real one that's going to cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's a big question about how do we afford to raise all of the dikes that need to get raised. Whether raising the dikes is actually the right solution is another big question. Another element of the story that we're just starting to think about is not just the water that comes over the top of the dike, but the water that comes in under the dike. And so dealing with the water table and the salinity of that water table is becoming a reality that people are confronted with. And so if you take a community like Crescent Beach in South Surrey, you have pumps running constantly to keep the water table below the ground. We see that somewhat in places like Brunswick Point. The farmlands right behind the dike there are just below seawater level. And if you go during a high tide, you can hear the pumps running. And they're basically trying to keep that table down. We've heard discussion from farmers in Richmond and South Surrey. I haven't participated in discussions in Delta around this, so I can't say for sure, but there've been discussions in some of the other farming communities about adding soil and trying to raise the farmlands above that water table by adding enough soil. Or there's conversations about moving the pumping intakes to manage the issue of salinity. So definitely discussions about moving the pump intakes up the Fraser to avoid saltwater intrusion is another element. So yes, there's the overtopping and there's the dike, which introduces the question of coastal squeeze. But then there's also how do we manage the water tables? I don't know that I put in an image of coastal squeeze, but I should explain what I just said there. Okay, so coastal squeeze is a concept that go back to the slide here. Yeah, it doesn't quite work, but if you're raising a dike, which is fine, that's great. because of sea level rise, you're making the dike bigger. Basically, though, what you're doing is meaning that in front of the dike, on the wet side of the dike, the ocean side of the dike, the water depth gets deeper. And so as you get deeper, you start to lose your intertidal habitat because it gets compressed up against the dike. It has nowhere to retreat to. And so what was traditionally something like eelgrass habitat becomes something like maybe salt pen habitat, red fern habitat. What was salt marsh habitat then maybe becomes eelgrass habitat, and you lose your sandy beach altogether. So it just, you kind of have that inland squeeze of different habitats. And as we see more and more elevation, we just lose more of that vegetation, which is highly productive. For the shorebirds, this is problematic because elevation plays a major role in their ability to access that fatty acid in those biofilms. So fatty acid production and exposure to fresh water is one trigger, but elevation and the amount of sunlight they're getting is another one. So that has a big impact. And then we have, on top of that, we have this human adaptive responses. So there's what's happening because of climate, and then there's what's happening because of how we respond. And so on the one side here, I have a picture of soil infilling. So that was the conversation we had about farmers proposing just to bring in more soil. But when we bring and add more soil on top of what's there, there's an impact in terms of the natural productivity values of that soil that we need to think about and manage. On the other side, there's a conversation happening around something called a living dike. And this is something that the city of Richmond is city of Delta is actively participating on Boundary Bay. There's a couple of pilot sites underway where we're exploring how can we add sediment on the wet side of the dike and plant vegetation in a way to try and naturally increase the elevation of that intertidal habitat as sea level rises. So slowly, as the water level rises, we'd add more sediment, plant some more vegetation, and try and bring that beachfront up and reproduce some natural habitat. It's not something we actually know how to do. It's something we're trying to figure out how to do. And we're trying to figure it out on a massive scale. But right now it's a couple of pilots. And so this is where that issue of biofilm comes into play, is if we're adding sediment, are we adding the right type of sediment, the right size, what the impacts on the available nutrients for shorebirds, and then, but I mean, also thinking about what the impacts on the vegetation, and can we actually successfully get colonialization of different vegetation types, salt marsh types on that wet side. So it's a big experiment, but I think in terms of big experiment, we are in a big adaptation experiment now. Given the level of climate change we're going to see, society's in a massive experiment, and so we're going to see more and more of these kind of tests and pilots playing out. So thinking about shorebirds and what they need, on the wet side of the dike, we need to think about maintaining insect productivity. What steps can we take as we adapt to maintain the production of available invertebrate populations for shorebirds and other birds to prey on? So it's things like maintaining wetlands or identifying wetlands, allowing ephemeral ponds, maintaining shrubs and wildlife trees, the urban. On the marine side of the dike, we're starting to get more sophisticated about thinking about mudflat habitat. And so thinking about elevation is a key one. Grain size, so sediment size, it can't be too sandy, it can't be too fine. There's a lot of Goldilocks conditions needed to keep that sediment just in place. And then thinking about how much exposure, how often it's wet, how often it's available to shorebirds. And then what is the freshwater inputs into the system. So one of the challenges with alternative sites like Mud Bay is that there's only so much fresh water coming out of the Semiahmoo Nakamako river system compared to the Fraser. So there's that availability of freshwater input is a major issue. Right. So I promised there would be another picture of a mud flat that looked completely different than the one that was at the beginning of the slide. And so this is a Western feeding on biofilm at Brunswick Point in April. And so this is pre stabilization and major blooms. So you can see it's much flatter, much thinner, and there's none of that kind of nice greeny seaweed substance on top. So when we talk, oh, here's my slide on coastal squeeze. So when we talk about sort of what is the human response, sometimes human responses are great in terms of how they meet human demands and reduce threats or uncertainty for our communities, but they can be ecologically maladaptive. And a good example is simply raising the dikes as a response to sea level rise. It's going to have a negative impact on our coastal ecosystems, but it could reduce the exposure of our human systems to flooding. There's a big could there. One of the challenges we face on the Delta is basically the Delta is like a bathtub. So we have a big bowl behind this dike that if there is a breach, we're going to see some pretty extensive flooding. So as we sea level rises and we put more of this hard infrastructure in place, the risk of a breach, the consequences of a breach become higher. So it's something to think about as we respond. So overall, what would be a broad strokes piece of advice is maintain ecological processes. And this is part of that debate that I raised earlier. Is do we think about species or do we think about habitats and maintaining habitats? And really, we have to do both. But if I was thinking in terms of broad brush, how do we try to adapt to climate on the Delta? It's around maintaining ecological processes, things like hydrological connectivity, disturbance regimes, occasional flooding if we can provide room for the river, places that are able to produce primary productivity, so the mud flats and the vegetation. And hopefully that allows, if we do lose some of the species, new species to come in and take advantage of those ongoing processes. Getting a little bit finer tuned in sort of what does that mean? You'll hear a lot of conversation around this new term, nature-based adaptation, and really it means shifting from thinking about our adaptation measures as hard infrastructure, so things like cement, rock, to thinking about our natural infrastructure, things like wetlands or grasslands, trees, things that allow ecological processes to take place on the landscape, while at the same time providing us as humans some level of buffer. Now, the challenge with nature-based adaptation and nature-based solutions is that they can be less predictive than less stable than our traditional built systems. So we're going to have to reimagine a bit of our relationship with infrastructure, but that's a conversation that's ongoing. And so there's a few of these types of projects happening around Delta. Some of them we have a lot of experience with. So I heard a conversation just before we came in around hedgerows. We're going to see more exploration of hedgerows and some of the other types of cover crops or allowing pollinator gardens, that kind of practices on the Delta. So the Delta Farmland Wildlife Trust has had that kind of experience, and we're starting to think more about some of the co-benefits of those practices, not just for waterfowl, but also thinking about pollinators and climate sequestration, that kind of thing. I touched a bit on the Living Dike project that being led by the city of Estuary, but the city of Delta is participating. And there are 13 projects in total associated with that pot of funding, which was $187 million towards that effort, and a long established community consultation process in Surrey on that. By far the best consultation I've seen in the Metro Vancouver area on climate adaptation. So definitely worth talking to your neighbors to the south and I guess slightly to the north about what how to encourage the city of Delta to engage in something quite so meaningful and in depth. We did hear also just as we came on, the city's investment in the urban reforestation project. So trees are everybody's favorite thing now, apparently. We're going to see a few $1 billion invested in planting trees, and some of that's going to be flowing through municipalities. In Delta's case, they've announced $330,000 for their urban reforestation program, but we're going to see more of that kind of investment as Canada tries to meet its obligations or commitments around planting trees. And in some places, we're going to see the breaching of dikes, and people are going to start to experiment with this concept of a managed shoreline realignment. So I've tried to switch my language from managed retreat because we're not really retreating, it's restoring. And so it's a managed realignment is the term I guess I'm using for that concept of breaching a dike and allowing water back into places that it has historically flooded. And so one such example is Ducks Unlimited South Arm Marshes Dike Breach, which is $2 million of investment enabled through the DFO Coastal Restoration Fund. So in terms of the Delta Nats, definitely continue to engage the city of Delta and their birds and biodiversity conservation strategy. There are some commitments in that around climate adaptation that need to be followed up on. Work with the city to identify nature-based solutions. And one of the things that's happening in this space is that what has traditionally been a world just for engineers is opening up to other sort of more innovative approaches. BC Nature has a climate action subcommittee headed by Karen Crosby. Her email is here, so I mean, engage with her if you want to explore nature-based solutions a bit more. And really think about protecting the Fraser Delta habitat more broadly. And here I use the Fraser Delta Key Biodiversity Area from further industrialization. Chat. I'll come back to this question on DU and the investment in the tech. In terms of protecting the Delta from industrial projects such as RBT2, right now, the key person to be connecting with is our Minister of Environment and Climate Change Canada. There is a form, like a click form, that people that haven't already contacted him could send a direct email to. But I know Delta Nats and BC Nature have written him letters already, and I would continue to engage with him on that. Nature Canada is hosting a Nature on the Hill event coming up February, I'm going to get it wrong, but I'm going to say February 18th, it's going to be the right ballpark, where they're helping people meet with MPs. So you can get a hold of me or Nature Canada directly and ask about whether it'd be possible to meet with your local MP or others that you think you would like to talk to about this issue. And you're not alone. So, I mean, I've identified some local actions that are happening, but this is an issue that people across the flyway are working to address. And there are flyway scale activities playing out, trying to identify resilient estuaries and protect them the best we can. A few of the groups working on this, the Pacific Birds Habitat Joint Venture, doing a ton of work, and their coordinator, the Canadian coordinator, is based here in Delta. So definitely take a look at their implementation plan. The America's Shoreway strategy is looking at the flyway as a whole. And then the Arctic Shorebird Demographic Network is doing that Arctic breeding ground monitoring and helping inform us on the Arctic related impacts. And lastly, I'd just say adaptation doesn't succeed without mitigation. We're in a bad place now in terms of the level of climate that we have to prepare for. And the question isn't whether it gets bad, it's bad now, and it's how much worse will it get. And it gets concerning. Yeah, I mean, for the fate of humanity, it gets concerning. And so contact your leaders and tell them to get off oil and gas. And the Tilbury Island example is one local Delta case, but really we need to make this transition as fast as possible because we're facing a scary future. But I'd been doing this for a couple of decades, and just before COVID, this is Vancouver on the People's Climate March. And I'm up by City Hall, and I took this picture out over the bridge, and it was packed. There were hundreds of thousands of people that showed up that day. And so I believe that the momentum, the support of the society is now behind this issue, and change is happening. And so there's reason for hope. We just need to buy as much time as possible with our adaptations as we make the transition. I'll leave it with that. So there are some credits and everything, but whatever. Yeah, that's it. I got some time for questions and discussion. I am going to go to that quick question in the chat. I saw it. Where did it go? Oh, here.
We'll get it in a second. Before we go into the questions, thanks, James, and I'll talk about what you've said in a minute, but before we get into the questions and discussion, I'd like to ask people to stick around for a few minutes because we have yet another door prize tonight. And so you want to be here for that. So we'll see if we can get these chat questions up here. That was a very interesting, thought-provoking, and in some respects depressing. But
sorry.
You haven't told us anything we didn't know.
Yeah.
we all, but actually you did, because some of the stuff you were talking about, it's much more complicated than non-scientific people like me would think. You know, it's there's just so much going on. It's so many different balls to juggle. It's just incredible. And when you look at it locally, it's unbelievable. When you think about it globally, it's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it definitely definitely every day is a what piece of it do I work on today, or what? Yeah, there's tons of it playing out. And it's where can we have the most impact, because we can't do it all, so we all do what we can. Yeah,
and that's pretty much the way it's going to have to both go, I think. I see we do have some questions. It's okay, we can get rid of the screen there. And Molly, also known as Val Fuller, is saying, should I sell my house now? On the slough.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so
in Ladner's, I think 20 meters is the height of Ladner. Is it going to be gone?
Yeah.
Yep.
I can't speak to your specific circumstance. But what I will share is I was part of the consultation taking place at Crescent Beach, and there was a lady there. They had just used their life savings to buy a piece of waterfront property, and in the process of that conversation, it became apparent either they were going to have to raise the dike by 2 meters, which would sort of block their waterfront view, or there was also on the table a scenario where they were going to not raise the dike and start buying out properties as a managed retreat strategy. So people are faced with this decision of land that they had, that they thought was, just buying a house that could be there for them and probably their grandkids to come enjoy, no longer feasible into the future. And we see that playing out right now in the Abbotsford area, in terms of not being able to get mortgages secured on floodplain property. And I'll say there's a a very tense discussion that has been ongoing for the last 3 or 4 years between the insurance industry and the government of Canada about how do we manage floodplains, and letting people know whether they live in a floodplain and whether they have access to insurance is something that the governments and the insurance industry can't agree on because of the cost. And so should you sell your house, I'll tell you what, I wouldn't buy on the Delta because of what how I feel about sea level rise and climate. And I know, like in Florida, we're seeing a decrease in home values as people start to realize the level of exposure they have. Whether that's going to play out in Delta, I don't think that's been determined, but there are going to be places on the Fraser Delta where we can't afford to have diked and protected the whole thing. So that's something to think about for sure.
We've got some comments going way back here. I'll just run them through quickly to
Okay.
Jonathan's. Did you see Jonathan's presentation, James?
Yeah, I caught it. Yeah,
Yeah,
it was lovely.
it was gorgeous. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anne Marie was saying it was marvelous. I think Karen Topham saying fabulous birds, an amazing segue with the music. Elta, stunningly beautiful. Catherine Milligan, thanks Jonathan for the rainbow bird presentation, very beautiful. Joe Stevenson saying, awesome, Jonathan. It was awesome. It was really quite incredible. And Joe Stevenson's got a comment here, which takes me back to a discussion I had not too long ago, and I think it was probably with David Hoare. He's saying, please note that we need to encourage cities and citizens to plant native, non-invasive species. And I think it was with David, I was having that discussion just last week about the fact that Delta is planting trees like crazy. They're not necessarily planting native trees. They're planting things that they've brought in, introduced things or cultivars that we can't recognize. You know, David's really good on trees, and you can look at these things and what is this? I know it's an ash, but not any kind of ash that you can identify. And I don't think this is really a very good thing. So encouraging Delta to plant native trees is probably a good idea.
Yeah, and I mean, one element you could work into that would be what is the impact of non-native species on their biodiversity strategy. So that if they're committed to providing habitat for species, they can look at what are the co-benefits of the climate and the biodiversity values of planting native species for sure.
Yeah. Was it you I was talking to, David?
Yes.
It was you I was talking to about, yeah, I thought so. I couldn't remember. It's been a rough few weeks. Okay, Anne Marie is just thanking you, James, for she appreciates your presentation of this information. And of course, we've been through Molly's comment or Valerie's comment. David and Noreen saying, we sold our house in Beach Grove and moved onto a boat after the first big flood event in 2006.
That's a true statement too.
It is a true statement. That's right. They did. Now they live in a condo now. It's a little bit higher ground.
The flood came to the house next door to us.
Pardon?
And the flood came as far as the house next door to us. So we vacated as soon as they cleared up all the mess.
Yeah, well, I mean, I have seen it coming up 2 blocks up 16th.
Yeah.
When we've had the king tide and really, really heavy rain. So, and I was just remembering way back when I was working, one of the appraisers there, when we asked him if he was, because he actually lived in Kelowna and he was commuting between Vancouver and Kelowna, his family was all in Kelowna, and we asked him if he was considering buying down here and if he considered buying in Delta, and he said, are you kidding? It's a floodplain. You wouldn't even think about it.
Yeah.
And now I hope I didn't miss something there. Oh, and he's just saying, thanks, James. This is so complicated. I hope that my condo won't float away. And Anne was saying Beach Grove and Boundary Bay were badly flooded some years ago. Buyer beware. Yeah, I think we are kind of aware that we live in a kind of dicey place right now. Anne is saying the Birds and Biodiversity Committee has raised this issue a couple of times with Todd Stewartson at Delta Parks. And with the Delta Environment staff too. So you're talking about the trees, Anne? Is Anne still there?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just unmuting.
Oh,
Yes, you were just addressing that question about planting non-native plants, and
Non-native,
bushes and trees and shrubs. And we have spoken a few times with them about this. It's because we meet fairly regularly, or we were, but we have actually had a Zoom meeting as well with Todd and, a few months ago. And it came up again then, but yeah, they have their reasons why they plant different things. You know, some of it's just what's easy to maintain, the rate of growth, the sort of trees that people wish to have and choose for some of that you're given a choice, you know, what you're going to have on your lawn. So it's a little bit difficult, but it's always been a question of education. And we've been pushing that as a society, Delta Naturalists, for many years, just educating them about nature. When I first came here 30 plus years ago, things were a lot worse in terms of the mayor and council than they are now in terms of understanding nature and the special nature of the habitat here. So, you know, the club's done a good job over the years, and others too, people like Birds Canada and so on.
And I was just thinking maybe one resource that we could look at leveraging is Vancouver Bird Advisory Committee has worked with Vancouver Parks on some planting guidelines, and maybe it's like we could set up a presentation from Vancouver Parks on their planting guidelines for birds or something like that, and invite the city to listen in. I mean, it's not like it's going to change their mind overnight, but seeing that other municipalities are tackling this issue might be of interest.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea because they do learn from each other, and it's nice for them to learn from their colleagues in other municipalities. We found that's worked on other issues in the past. So that would be a helpful thing to do, I think, if you were interested in working on that in due course. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's on the list.
Yeah.
Good. Awesome.
Thank you.
Jim Ronback
Very
has a
nice
question.
presentation.
Yes. There's an elephant in the room that seldom gets discussed, and that is, what is the value of a loss of species compared to the value of a loss of a human life? Insurance companies deal with values of a loss of human life when they try to figure out what awards they give when something bad happens. But we don't put any value on items in nature, like loss of a river habitat or loss of a species or the loss of biofilm. Has any attempt been made to look into placing a value on elements of nature?
Yes. It's the term value. It's okay. So there's a lot to unpack there, and that I think probably is worth another session. But in short response, the term value can mean either monetary value or societal value. Those don't have to be the same thing. There has been work on putting monetary value on things such as natural capital or natural assets. And so the city of Surrey is undergoing a natural asset assessment, looking at sort of what is the infrastructure value of some of the things like wetland riparian habitats or trees, that kind of thing. And they are looking at it from the perspective of if they had to replace that infrastructure. So if they had to take a stream and put it in a pipe, how much would it cost the city? So it's that kind of replacement monetary value. Others have looked at it from the perspective of what would your willingness to pay for that value be? So it's, if let's say I wanted to go see oh, a stellar sea eagle, which I really, really do want to go see. And I'll probably spend $10,000, $20,000 to go try and find my stellar sea lion or sea eagle one day. That's the willingness to pay approach. But then there's others that have said, well, you can't really put a monetary value on some of these things. And so thinking about what is the societal value of having clean air or being able to go out and listen to the birds sing. Those are things you can't really say what you want to pay for those or what you want to charge for those. Those are the things that as society we want to be able to give to our future generations. And so there's an inherent value in those things. And so that's another approach that has taken place. And so I think I heard Anita say as I was coming in here, a book around the rights of the river or the rights of nature speak to that inherent value. And so there are efforts on the Fraser to look at how do we take a rights-based approach or an inherent value-based approach to how we make decisions about what the trade-offs are. And then sort of I've been part of conversations around instead of calling it a biodiversity collapse, why aren't we referring it to an ecocide in the same way we talk about genocide in terms of the value of the species that we are losing during this great extinction event? So that's a range of yeses to your question about values. Which one of those has the most impact and serves our ends the best is very hotly debated. And would be a fabulous conversation for probably another 2 or 3 hours.
Does the government make use of these values?
So the one that or sure, go ahead.
During their environmental assessment, do any governments make use of these environmental values?
So within the EA process, the environmental assessment process, I have the one value that is being taken into consideration is the carbon value. So we see carbon has been monetized within the global system. And so we see that carbon sequestration or mitigation value considered within the EA process. I have seen people submit willingness to pay assessments in terms of the values being lost. And sometimes that's framed around tourism. That doesn't tend to carry much weight. Where we are seeing actual uptake of the concept of valuation is in the infrastructure management plans of municipalities. So if you were to look at the town of Gibsons, they have started incorporating natural assets into their budget and their balance for their municipality. And so that they can spend money, taxpayer money, on maintaining natural assets for the services that provide to the community. So that's a very tangible way of people thinking about values beyond just the carbon mitigation one. On the Delta, we're seeing something known as the Farmland Advantage Program. So the BC government is looking at what used to be called payment for ecosystem services, but is now looking at basically trying to figure out how to compensate farmers for the natural values that they provide on their farmland for society. And so the Farmland Advantage Program is another case of looking at the values provided to society writ large and providing monetary benefit for it. It gets very tricky very quickly as we start to talk about the concepts of habitat banking and what actually counts as a valued ecosystem service and whatnot. But yeah, it's playing out.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. There's a very nice comment here from Elsa saying, thank heavens for drivers such as yourself, James. For every challenge brought forward, we need to embrace it as an opportunity to create change. And it's nice to see a very positive take on this. So any more questions from anyone?
Yes, I'd like to say something. Not at all municipalities or Delta though. Some of us in this group live in Richmond, and we feel somehow there's a bit of a different outlook here. There are different sectors of society have a different outlook on what's important and what isn't important. And another, before I finish with that question, just one more thing I wanted to say about the trees, and that is, I think some of the areas in islands such as we live on here, the trees aren't natural in the first place. You know, other types of vegetation are like hedges or I don't know, whatever. But anyways, where is he? What do you have to say about that, James, wherever you are?
Could I get you to just repeat the key question that you're thinking of?
Question was that not every municipality seems to have the same outlook as Delta. They have you know, different outlooks regarding nature, or you know, how much they care about nature or that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would say, like, not every counselor has the same perspective on how important they value nature, for sure. And different communities have different makeups in terms of the population and what their economic activities are and the level of exposure they have to the natural environment. So definitely Richmond has a different community than Delta has, and Surrey has, again, a different community. And one of the challenges is getting people out into the environment in which they live. And so this is where God bless Tom Beers. I miss him dearly in terms of organizing the casual bird walks and the amount of engagement he did. And that type of activity from Delta Nats is so important. It's one of the reasons Birds Canada has been really thrilled to get bird watching kits into the libraries to try and get those kids out into birding more. But I mean, anybody that can get somebody out on the land and experience what's happening around them and get that sense of the seasons and the flow of nature, as opposed to the flow of electricity and the ability to turn on the computer, is, I think, an essential part of addressing that difference in our communities that we see.
I think in our city that you know, there isn't a lack of people out in nature, but they just have other interests in investment and that nature of things. And so you know, things are built that perhaps shouldn't be built, and you know, too much land is taken up by those buildings.
Yeah.
I see. Oh, we had a couple of other comments here. We need to add it. Oh, I can't find that. I need to add a comment there. And oh, I'll find Anita's in a minute here, but Annie Capps is saying that BC doctors can now prescribe national park passes to patients who need nature time, which I think is a lovely concept.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we definitely heard that during COVID, nature and birds and slowing down and connecting was a key part to people dealing with the stress, and it's good to have that recognized, for sure. And I think it'll continue to grow.
Yeah. And Anita had another comment saying, speaking of value, animals and plants in nature have an intrinsic value, the rights of nature.
Yep.
And great. So, are we finished with discussion now? Nope, Paul's got his hand up. Nope, okay.
I'll just say before you wrap up there, Elizabeth, that the video playing behind me is another one by Jason Puttyfoot. Again, it's
Yes.
Shorebirds feeding.
Yes,
I'm going to step out of the frame so my head's not in the way and let you guys enjoy that.
Yeah, they're lovely. I wish could see it behind you there. It's beautiful.
Excellent.
Yeah. Okay, so people can see that. So I think maybe we're done with that. Thank you very much, James. That was a very thought-provoking presentation, and gives us lots to think about, lots to wonder how we can actually play a part in trying to make things better. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Lorraine and Joanne, because Lorraine has the door prize. And Joanne has been writing down names and putting them in a hat. And we'll pull something. Okay, Lorraine, what have you got there? Ooh, that's kind of hard to see.
Your mic's off, Lorraine.
No, I wasn't gonna talk. I was gonna let Joanne do the talking.
Oh,
I don't know what it is though. Anyway,
Okay, it's a chocolate treat from the Chocolate Bear in Tawasin.
oh, awesome.
okay.
Valentine appropriate.
Okay, well,
Valentine's Day.
I put everybody's name in this bag and I have taken a name out. And Elta, you're the winner. Yeah, congratulations. Lorraine's going to get in touch with you on how to get it to you. I hope you don't
That's
live in New
great.
York.
Well, thank you so much. Yay.
Thanks, Lorraine, for organizing this.
Yes, thank you very much.
She's our fun-loving social coordinator, so
Yes.
she loves straws and surprises. So she's exciting to have on our board here.
Yes, she is, yes.
Yeah.
And thank you to you too, Joanne, for taking the time to write down all those names. Okay, folks, so our next meeting is March 1st. And our speaker next time is going to be David Hoare. He's going to do something on underwater in Micronesia. Amongst all his other talents, David was a diver. And he's apparently taken a bunch of underwater film in Micronesia. And so that's where we'll be going next time. We had to switch Martin Gregus because he was booked for next time, but he's going to be in London, England, and presentation time would have been 4 o'clock in the morning London time. So that wasn't working too well for him. So David said he would step in and we'll have Martin coming from French Polynesia for the April one. So thanks, everybody. Does anybody else have any comments, questions before we sign off?
Just one thing. After that presentation, I think I'm going to double up on my antidepressants.
And I'm going to sell my house.
Say that, Molly.
Maybe double up on your house insurance.
If you're able to.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, my insurance guy is not going to go for it.
yeah.
Yeah, or buy some life jackets, Molly.
Learn to swim.
Well, you may end up with beachfront, so it's not all bad.
True.
Keep a canoe in the backyard.
Yeah.
Maybe you can train that beaver to build you a little dam. Instead of trying to take down the trees.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.